Our keynote speaker, Pat Mitchell, has done amazing work in the world, and I want to take just a moment to share some of her many accomplishments. A trailblazing journalist and media specialist, Pat Mitchell is the former president and CEO of the Paley Center for Media and the very first woman president and CEO of PBS. She has worked for 3 broadcast networks and several cable channels, winning national acclaim both in front of and behind the camera as a reporter, news anchor, talk show host, White House correspondent, producer, and executive. Ms. Mitchell has received numerous awards during the course of her career, including being named to Newsweek's 2011 list of 150 women who shake the world, the Huffington Post 2012 list of the most powerful women over 50, and Forbes.com list of women changing the world. Wouldn't you like to be on some of those lists? In addition to her accomplishments, both on and off the screen, Pat is also known for her humanitarian efforts and her work as a dedicated member of numerous nonprofit and corporate boards. Everyone, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Pat Mitchell.
Well, good morning. I love starting the day with Seattle's best. And I'm not talking about the coffee, although it is my favorite. Thank you for the coffee and the gift bag. I love starting my day with Seattle's best and most powerful women and the male warriors who support them, of course. You know, usually when I walk in a room like this, full of women, I immediately, of course, feel more powerful just by the association. But often when I use that word to describe the gathering, I sense a little discomfort. You may be feeling not altogether comfortable, although I can't imagine that everyone in this room isn't feeling more powerful from all of the progress and all of the work that we've heard about so far this morning. I am impressed and deeply inspired, Liz, by this organization and all of the women who have been on this stage and the stories they've shared. But usually women prefer to be described as successful, yes, smart, philanthropic, strategic, women with access and influence. These are all terms that feel more comfortable to us often, and there's little wonder about that because power summons up all other kinds of images persistently and prevalently given to us, mostly by the media, stereotypical portrayals of what power looks like, usually a man in a well-tailored suit or uniform, talking tough, taking control. And even more disturbing for us are the stories of the abuse of power, of the corruption of power being used to violate and dominate, and most often women. So no surprise, given that those are the images that play in our mind around that word, that many of us have a complex and really difficult relationship with the concept of our own power. We're more comfortable, as I said, with words like influential and philanthropic, which certainly describes every single person in this room. You are powerful because you are making a huge difference in the lives of women, girls, families, and this community. And wherever else your passions and your philanthropic giving, your work and your volunteerism, your activism and your engagement is extending your power, and for me, confirms it. So good morning, powerful women of Seattle. And thank you. Thank you for inviting me to share a few thoughts about our power as women and why I believe so strongly that it matters more than ever that we claim it, use it to empower others. So let me start your day with some good news. You've already heard lots of it this morning, as well as news reminding us of the gaps that remain in the work to be done. But in fact, there has never been a better time to have been born a woman, at least in the parts of the world where we live and work. Every social progress index that's been released in the last few years says that women, fully educated, politically emancipated, economically empowered, and that's all of us, are the world's best hope for finding solutions to today's complex problems. And there's further good news, too. We have what we need. We have the means, we have the money, we have the access, we have the media and the technology to make us better prepared to take up this responsibility than any generation of women who ever lived. Now, I don't remember the first time that I heard myself described as powerful. I don't even remember the first time that I might have felt my personal power. But I will never forget the first time I heard a woman I admired and was inspired by stand in front of a room like this and challenge me and all the rest of us to think about our power differently. It was 1990. I was reporting from the first global conference for peace convened by women. A New York congresswoman named Bella Abzug stood up in the first session and said, "In the 20th century, women must change the nature of power rather than power changing the nature of women." For the following 3 days of that peace negotiation, I witnessed the difference that women's nature bring to power. More than 1,000 Jewish and Arab women were in that room. They put aside their deep historical differences to listen to each other. They identified ways to collaborate, to seek consensus, and at the end of 3 days, they negotiated and agreed to a 7-page document that would have ended the conflict in the Middle East, then and perhaps even now. Now, their work never received the endorsement of the people who had elected power in either of their communities, and it languishes somewhere, and the conflicts worsen. But many of those same women are continuing their work today for peaceful solutions and better futures. They've not given up their power or the potential for their work, and more importantly, they've not given up their faith that their collective power will eventually make a difference. During my years as a journalist, a documentary producer, and later as an executive, and now in a phase of life that I like to call rewiring, not retiring, I'm trying to find new ways to use my power and influence, to realize the nature of my power, my resources, my time, to support the empowerment and the full potential for other women. And along the way, I have met women on both sides of the power divide, those who have and those who have not. I've witnessed women living without the rights that we take for granted, without economic security, with even enough money to feed themselves or their families. These women have taught me so much about the power of women to survive, to thrive, to keep their families and communities going, to step into leadership, and to take the kinds of daunting risks that lead to awesome results. Quite literally, I have witnessed women with no power, no position, no influence, no access, translate pain to power with a kind of resilience and resolve that is hard to understand but is so deeply inspiring. These experiences, some of which I shared with an amazing woman in this room this morning, Mary Ellen Cunningham, they have taught me so much about personal power and how we use it to create new pathways to power for others. Mary Ellen and I traveled to the Democratic Republic of Congo, to the eastern part, Bukavu, where so much of the conflict is happening and the war is being fought on the bodies of women, hundreds of thousands of them raped and brutalized every year. But what Mary Ellen and I witnessed there was a healing and a training community called the City of Joy, where every day pain transforms to power. Every day women are healed and trained and turned from victim to survivor, and even more significantly, to leader. They walk out of that community prepared, ready to change the future of their part of this extraordinary country. I believe the future of women in this state is being improved every single day by what you are already doing. I heard it this morning. I read it in my preparation. I've talked to Liz and Mary Ellen and others of you about the work that you're committed to doing, the pathways, the programs, and the actions that you've already created that are helping shape new ways out of poverty, new ways to greater equality across this great state. We have some good company in this struggle. Former President Jimmy Carter wrote recently in his amazing book, A Call to Action. Women's inequality has profoundly affected our world. In every country, it is violence against women, the silencing of women, the political, social, and cultural restrictions placed on women that are perpetuating poverty, disease, war. So it is not just for women and girls that we must act. We must act to save the planet. And allowing women access to opportunity and education empowers them to become part of the solutions so badly needed for today's complex challenges. Many other leaders have spoken as well. The International Monetary Fund chief, Christine Lagarde, recently presented to the world's global financial leaders a new report indicating that the economies in every single one of their countries would go up by 30%, as well as increase the global GDP, if they just educated girls one more year, if they gave women greater access to the economic opportunity, and if they put the estimated 2 billion women who are underemployed or working without pay into the global economic workforce, it's the single biggest game changer for the world's sustainable economic future. And just to add to this growing body of data that keeps making the case that greater equality is not just the right thing to do, it is a smart thing to do. The September McKinsey report that just came out on women indicates that if you fully employ women, you close the wage gap that we've heard so much about this morning. Advance workforce equality, you'll add as much as $12 trillion to the global GDP. I don't want to wait to the year 2025, or as Liz said, 2075. I won't be here for that one for sure. But doesn't all this feel good? It feels good to know that all the stats and all the data can be validated now, that our value every day in some social progress index is further validated. We have made the case for economic equality, as well as cultural and political and social economy. So why doesn't the picture of the world look like that? The analysis of our economic value is clearly not syncing up with the realities for women and girls in this state and around the world. And that is one of the aspects of great admiration for me, for the work that you have chosen to be a part of with the Women's Funding Alliance. And congratulations on this progress. As I traveled around the world, I've looked for other examples to share. I found one this summer in Iceland. Many of you may know the history of that country, that in 1975, every single woman in the country walked off their job and out of their homes. They brought the country to a standstill. It was the first global women's strike, and it inspired many of the marches and protests in this country and around the world. And a few years later, they elected the first woman president of any country in the world. She is still alive. She is still active. They elected the first lesbian prime minister. And when Iceland was on the brink of bankruptcy during the global financial crisis, 2 Icelandic women under the age of 35 redesigned the entire financial system on what they call feminine values and kept Iceland from going bankrupt. Iceland is today the #1 place in the world to live for quality of life and gender equality. They have decided to close the wage gap. Too costly, we heard from the CEOs whose companies work in that country. But everyone has agreed that in the next 2 years, there will be equal pay for equal work. You may also remember that it was Iceland, Sweden, and Norway that mandated that all companies operating in those countries have 40% of their management be women and 40% of the representation in their boardrooms be women. And once again, the protests were loud, too costly, can't be done in such a short time frame. It was done. And the results 5 years later are that one change, or 2 changes in terms of management and boardroom, has been great news, increasing profits, better for shareholders, better for consumers, and certainly better for women and families. Now, when I talk about these countries, skeptics like to suggest that big changes are possible in small countries. But the evidence is that big changes are possible everywhere if we adapt what the Icelandic women call fierce compassion. Now, fierce and compassion may be 2 terms that sort of don't seem to go together, right? Somewhat like power. But fierce compassion is saying a time for boldness, a time for philanthropy combined with innovation, a time to redefine the way that we're going about using our power. So it changes everything when you think of using power in that way, fiercely, but with compassion that understands power comes with responsibility, and power is best when shared. Now, this is the kind of power that causes barriers to fall, causes gaps to close. I have seen around the world different interpretations of fierce compassion. In many countries, like Afghanistan, fierce compassion translated to the women's decision to keep the schools open during the years of Taliban to make sure that women and girls were educated. Recently, in the revolutions in Libya, Tunisia, and Egypt, we saw fierce compassion translated to the women taking roles in the revolutions and then deciding to run for leadership positions in their newly elected governments. They look to us now, and they say, what are American women with all that power and privilege? How are they employing a fierce compassion? Well, let's start with what we have. Let's start with money. With increased income and education and the fact that 40% of the world's wealth is passing into the hands of women over the next few years, we need to think a lot about the power of money and how we're using it. There was new research, some of you may have seen, commissioned by the Women Moving Millions group. None of it terribly surprising, but in some ways it's interesting to just review a few of the headlines. Certainly, women tend to spread their giving out over more organizations, while men tend to concentrate their giving. Single women give more than single men. Marriage increases giving, but the majority of married couples decide on their charity giving jointly, and when there is a debate, often the woman goes with the husband's giving preferences. So looking at the research that is in this report about the way we give, we see a lot of room for a change, for more fierce compassion in our bargaining and in our decisions. We are more likely to give collaboratively through groups like this. this research reminds us why coalitions and alliances that power our money on a collective basis are so important in our lives. The needs are greater, and the big funders have not responded. Less than 7% of the money from the big foundations in this country is going to women and girls. That needs to change. So as we change our own giving, we need to start to monitor more carefully the giving of the world's big foundations and donors. Women Moving Millions is one of the organization groups that recognizes women who give more than $1 million a year to women and girls. And they're trying, as this group is trying, to change the picture of women's philanthropy, make it look a lot like fierce compassion in action. Remembering Bella's words, making it look a lot like the nature of women is also changing the nature of philanthropy. Now let's talk for a minute about the nature of women. I assume that you agree with me that we are in fact different from men, and we know now from brain scientists and every other kind of research that these differences have been validated. And yet, so much of my working life and the working life I heard described this morning still pressures us to diminish our differences. As Candace referenced, when I first started in television, as did she, we were encouraged to make sure no one noticed we were different. We wore ugly suits. We wore scarves that looked like ties. We lowered our voices, and we never, ever, ever talked about our families, our children, and we never volunteered to cover a women's story. That was the reality of bringing women into television for what purpose? A more inclusive voice, a different look, a different point of view and perspective, and yet we wasted so much time and energy proving we were the same, proving we could do the same stories, report the same way, when all the value of our being there was in bringing our full women's nature to our work, and therefore reflecting the points of view, experiences, and perspectives of more than half of the people watching television. So we know now, actually it's more than half, and especially if you look at new media, where we are leading in all numbers. But these new studies that have come out that conclude that women's brains are wired differently. They are wired for more collaboration, more consensus building, more... in fact, they're wired in ways that you may have seen this conclusion from Harvard recently, that given the nature of women's brains, that we would make better judges and men better presidents. I'm not sure I'd go completely along with that, believing that we might have a stronger democracy and a more equitable world if we had a little more empathy and consensus building and less need to dominate. Now, please understand, I'm not saying that we are monolithic, that all of our natures are the same, that we agree on all points as women. If we did, we would have changed the power paradigm a long time ago. But I am saying that what we bring to our jobs, to our work, to our philanthropy, to everything we do in the world, when we bring our full experiences as wives, mothers, grandmothers, sisters, our full experiences as women, we then change the nature of power rather than the other way around. And sometimes this is not so easy, a clear cut. My good friend Eve Ensler, the author of the Vagina Monologues, likes to say, particularly during political elections, just because a woman has a vagina doesn't mean she has the same values. And that difference is going to play out in this year's presidential campaign. Two women, two different value sets, two different opinions on most issues, both running for the presidency. And at least in this election, the one subject that there may be less focus on in terms of these two women is their hairstyle. because here they have a little competition from Donald Trump. I welcome the move away from describing Hillary's well-tailored suit or Carly's new haircut. But with both of these women and with the challenge for us as women to make decisions and use our power as voters, it's maybe our single biggest power except for one other. And that power to vote, as Candace reminded us so brilliantly, was fought for by women giving up their lives. And they said when they got the right to vote, not for ourselves alone. Many of them never lived to vote. So how can we do anything other than exercise that power? But there's another kind of power that I want us to think about, because in some ways, by many measurements, it is the single biggest power that we have collectively, and that is media and technology. It's in our beautiful bags or hidden in our laps for those quick tweets. It's at our fingertips. It is connecting us for the first time to potentially every other woman in the world. As you know, and certainly in this city, mobile technology is the fastest take-up and the most transformative technology in our lifetime. And now with Google and Apple competing to make the entire world connected on the internet, we could have as many as 7 billion people with mobile technology in the next few years. So what's going to change with that power, particularly in the hands of women? Here again, just to share a couple of stories of what I've been privileged to witness as women with so much less power and access have taken up this technology and have used it to change their lives and the lives of others. Mobile phones in the Congo, for example, are specially equipped now with a GPS system and an alert button, so that when women go into the woods to gather food and wood, which they must for their families, that makes them vulnerable to the rebel forces living there. They can push a button if they see a man or a rebel soldier nearby, and that button alerts every other woman in the woods, as well as the GPS tracking can lead authorities to the rebel soldiers. In Kenya, mobile phones are now being used by the coffee and tea farmers, most of whom are women. These specially equipped phones give them the ability to take their product to market and no longer be cheated by those who are weighing the amount or the money they're owed. It shows up instantly on their phone, which then goes to the bank, and the money is instantly transferred for next year's fertilizer and product. It's bringing them power of transparency and accountability. There's so many other examples that I could share with you to make the point that technology, which is such an integral part of all of our lives and our work, can be used for so much more. In Afghanistan and Pakistan, it's used to help midwives deliver babies through difficult deliveries, taking instructions from doctors hundreds of miles away. There are ways that you and I can use this power of connectivity to better connect and change the lives of women. One way we can exercise it, which takes no change at all except in the way we think about media as a media consumer. We can start to demand that all media that we are consuming starts to look a lot like the lives that we lead as women. There is a huge gender gap in the world of media and technology, no news to anyone in this room, but what in my opinion is important to remember is that media is the message and also the messenger. What we are learning, the way our sons and daughters are learning about everything from how to dress to sex, especially sex, it is modeling for all of us a power paradigm that has to change if we're going to change the way we feel about power, the way we define it. We have a way to make our voices heard, Many projects, the Misrepresentation Project, I refer you to it, is saying, let's ask for more. Let's demand that the people making decisions about what stories are covered, what news hits the front page and on the headlines, what is on social media. Let's be an active user of media and technology. And if all else fails, use that most powerful button of all, called off. Most significantly, I'm worried about a gender gap and a gender deficit in leadership. As Candace and others have mentioned this morning, we are not doing well in this country in terms of women's leadership. Even though we do have 2 women running for the presidency, we have fewer women in Congress than we did in 1992. We have fewer women in positions of leadership in states. We have fewer women CEOs in the corporate world. And what troubles me most about this is what I'm hearing from the young women. The young women who say to me, I don't want to be the boss. I don't want to be the leader. I don't want the life that I've seen so many of my mother's generation live. We have to begin to change the way that women see and think about leadership. This is worrisome because as we look around for the next generation of leaders, here is this millennial generation so conversant, so engaged, so ready and prepared to be leaders. They know how to use all of the power that we have just talked about and thought about this morning. They need to find women leaders modeling a different kind of leadership. The next time that someone says to you, oh yeah, women leaders, like Indira Gandhi or Golda Meir or Margaret Thatcher, they're always thrown out as examples of women who didn't lead from feminine values, but who rattled swords as well as any man. Remind them there are other examples today. There's the example of Ellen Sirleaf Johnson, the first woman elected president in Africa, the country of Liberia. I interviewed her recently, and I said to her, you know, women describe you as the Iron Lady of Africa, with an obvious reference to Margaret Thatcher. How do you feel about that? And she said, when you're the leader of a country coming out of a long period of conflict, still facing violence and insecurity, yes, you have to be an Iron Lady. And I don't mind being thought of as tough. I need to be. But then she added, but however, I prefer to be thought of as Mama Ellen. It was the women of this country who elected me, and as their representative, I built schools, not built armies. I improved the roads. I made education accessible to girls. I'm returning this country to its women. And then you look at Michelle Bachelet in Chile, who risked her election so that she could give women greater control over their reproductive health. There are examples of this now in the world. We need more women using their power from their own natures rather than having the power change them. My former boss and good friend and now co-grandparent, our children are married to each other, Ted Turner, I should say our son is married to his daughter, would that clarify? He stood in front of the UN not long ago and said that he felt that men should be banned from running for elected office for at least 100 years. He thought it would take that long to rid the world of what he described as testosterone poisoning. Well, I'd like to suggest, Ted does tend to go a bit far, that a better solution might be for the powerful women who don't have testosterone poisoning, but do have the female brain differently wired, who do have our lives differently lived and experienced and composed, and yes, rewired too, and with our personal and collective power intact, and in full force, practicing fierce compassion, then we don't need 100 years to have a more peaceful, prosperous world. We can have it now. And we will have it now if we do one thing well, if we support each other. That for me, and I want to thank Liz for referencing it as an early discovery. Reaching down, helping the woman behind move to the next position of leadership, mentoring in the way we live, modeling in the way we lead, having each other's backs. That may be our single biggest way to shift the power paradigm once and for all, and to really move us towards a world where power and responsibility are united and shared. Then rights can be secured for everyone. And we will have changed the nature of power, and we will have changed the future for all generations to come. Thank you.